Good morning, everyone. Lance Tarchioni here with you on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We're back in the Nutrient Studios south of lovely Macomb, Illinois. I got producer Adam here with me today, and we're excited to talk with you about some fall topics. Adam and I were just visiting here about supply management and how to run a territory, and I'm giving him all kinds of unhelpful advice from somebody who's never done his job about how I could make his job better. And anyway, so we've been having a good time here, and I just realized it's 7:30, so it's time to get going with Ask the Agronomist. So I've got some topics related to fertility, a little bit of corn on corn conversation. I want to give a kind of a fertilizer update. Just talked to a friend of mine that's a retail manages some retail facilities, talking about anhydrous and what's going on out in the marketplace from a supply standpoint. So we'll touch on that. Hopefully we'll answer your questions. Probably going to be a little bit of a lighter crowd today. A lot of you, like myself, are probably either still harvesting or still putting on anhydrous or still working on tillage or fertility, or a lot of the things we're going to talk about on Ask the Agronomist today, ironically, are why you're not here watching, because you're busy doing all the things that we're going to talk about. And that's kind of what it's like being an agronomist. You spend a lot of time talking about things other people are doing. And sometimes probably irritate people that are actually doing it because I'm just talking about it. But anyway, thanks for joining. Just a reminder, if you do want to live chat in a question, which we love our live chat questions, all you got to do is be logged in either via your YouTube account or a Gmail email account. A Google-based email address will get you logged into the live chat, so you can text in your questions to producer Adam, and he will make me aware of the questions that are out there, and we'll touch on them. So hopefully you're, if not done with harvest, you're nearing harvest. We finished soybeans yesterday on our farm, so it shows you what a challenging situation my farming operation is. I was getting teased by our soybean product manager. He didn't realize anybody in Central Illinois was still harvesting soybeans in November. And I said, well, one of your agronomists is. And we had 3 bean heads on the same combine yesterday to get 20 acres done. So that tells you how the day went. But at 10 o'clock last night, the beans were still cutting nice. We finished at like 9:57 last night, got semi full, grain carts full, combine full. We had to drag a gravity wagon out of the shed to dump the last 150 bushel on. But soybean harvest is done on my farm. And I got about 110 acres of corn left to go, which is not all going to get done before it rains tomorrow. So I will still be harvesting on the backside of this next rain event. You're probably further along than I am on your farm, and good for you. I hope harvest has gone well. Generally speaking, things have held together pretty well. Most corn that has not been harvested is still standing, relatively good. Stock quality's never good at this time of year, but it's better this year than it was last year by far. And, hopefully we don't get any strong wind events or any storms or anything with these rains to make a mess out of the corn that's still out in the field. Probably if I've had conversations with people disappointed in yields, it's generally related to soybeans more often than corn. I have had a few people that were disappointed in some, corn that was yielding in the low 200s because they know that somebody else had some that made 270. Met with some really good customers a couple days ago that farm in a pretty good area, very good managers, 2,000 acres of corn, honest across the scale yields, had like a 266 farm average on 2,000 acres of corn, which is phenomenal. I rarely saw a 266 on the yield monitor going through the field, let alone having a field average of 266 or a farm average of 266. So there's certainly been some good corn out there. These same producers were disappointed in their beans. Their beans were outstanding as well, but not by their standards. So a lot of guys that have gotten used to, hitting 80 and 90 on soybean field average yields, didn't see much of that this year. And there were actually some beans that struggled to make 60 in some situation. So typically, if you look back at your weather, if you were disappointed in your beans, first thing I'd ask you to do is look at how much rain you received from like the last week of July through the end of August. And if from the last week of July through the month of August, you were looking at an inch and a half of rain or less, I don't realistically know how you could expect beans to make more than 70 with an inch and a half of rain for a 5-week stretch from late July through August. And there's probably some little pockets out there that didn't even have that much. You get into areas where we had, plentiful rain in late July through August, we did see 80 and 90 bushel field average bean yields. In some places, the early beans were way better, both early planted and early maturing beans in some cases. So there's a few things that are, a little atypical in our yield trends in soybeans this year. And, they all relate back to, what type of weather did we have during pod fill for those beans. We've had a few situations where guys have had some really tough cutting green stem soybeans that yielded poorly. Typically we're used to beans that are tough yielding really well. And so you have that good yield to kind of offset your frustration with how hard they are to cut. I had a guy ask me, he said, I want 90 bushel beans that stand good, that cut easy. I'm like, well, I can't help you, man, because if your beans are making 90, they will be lodged and they will be tough as hell. I about guarantee it. If they're standing good and cut like butter, they're probably making 67. So it's tough. But what gets really frustrating, and I know a colleague of mine, Randy Niver, dealt with a lot of this in Eastern Illinois, when you have green stem soybeans that are hard to cut that are making 60 or less, that's even more irritating. Well, that situation was caused by some severe drought stress during pod set, and we aborted a lot of pods off those plants. And then weather conditions improved later in the summer. And so you had a plant in late August that had relatively few pods on it because it had been going through hell earlier in the summer. And so it had plenty of resources and not enough pod load on it to fully utilize those resources. Soybeans are typically what Dr. Bilo would refer to as a source limited plant, because the plant cannot create enough photosynthates to support the pod load and the seed load that it's trying to fill. This was just the inverse of that, where you had a plant that was healthy, had good growing conditions, had good crop canopy, was able to produce more photosynthates than it had seed that it could grow. And so you've got an excess of resources in that plant. So that's what makes that stem green, healthy, tough, hanging on the leaves, not maturing, the way you would like them to. So in some places we had beans dying early because of disease, and other places we had beans that, never died because they didn't have enough pods on them for the plant to senesce properly. But just generally speaking across the board, it was not as good of growing conditions for soybeans this year as it was for corn. Generally speaking, we had more rainfall in July than we did in August, which sets up better for corn than beans. We had, probably most people were pleasantly surprised with their corn yields. Not very many people were pleasantly surprised with their soybean yields, and especially relative to corn. If your corn ended up being, 20 bushel better than you expected it to be, and your soybeans ended up being 10 bushel worse than you hoped they would be, there was kind of a divergence of the two crops there, where one's, pleasant surprise and the other one's a bit of a disappointment. And I think most of that relates back to the growing season, the weather, the challenges that we had. Those challenges impacted the soybean crop more than the corn crop. A lot of people are going to have a lot of theories to explain, why beans struggled. But I think if you just look back at your weather patterns, see how much rainfall you got in August, see when it came, look at what you had in late July, because those late July rains are pretty important for we talk about August with soybeans. But if you're planting beans in early April, especially if you're planting group 2s in early April, July is kind of the new August for those early planted early beans. So late July and August, we got some good rains after Labor Day. But if your beans were already starting to turn, which most of them were by the time those Labor Day rains came through, those rains did nothing to help that crop. So, and if you had some late planted full season beans that were still green as grass when those rains came, those beans benefited from that. But they'd been on a downward trajectory, up until then. And if you've been on a downward trajectory for 5 weeks and then you get a little bit of an up bump at the end, you may not get back up to where you wanted to be. You just ended up being better than you would have been had it not have rained there on those late rains after Labor Day. So, Adam, you've been sitting there patiently, like you maybe wanted to make a comment, or if a question come in or something.
No question, just a comment, follow up. I guess I agree with your synopsis of the environment and the interaction.
It's always best when the producer agrees with the agronomist. It's like,
but the environment, the interaction with planting date. I guess the take home message I feel like is still try and get out there early and plant your beans.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yep.
Seems like the best advice I can give anybody.
Yep. No, I agree. We didn't, early planting does not guarantee you more beans, but it is close as anything you can do to guaranteeing yourself more beans. You are definitely guaranteeing yourself more potential. Whether you realize that greater potential or not kind of depends on what happens later. But yeah, I'm still a big fan of early planting. Now we do have to, we got to manage the residue. We got to manage the herbicide stress. There's things that we have to manage. And the reality is I've talked to some producers that are tempted to tweak or weaken or lessen, or they'd love to completely remove the residual component of their pre-emergent herbicide program because they feel it's stressing their beans and slowing their beans down, and it is. But we need those products. We are not going to have successful weed control long-term sustainably without those products. So we are not losing soybean stands typically because of herbicide stress, but we do see some herbicide injury. We see some herbicide symptomology. We see beans that grow a little bit slower because of those herbicides, but they serve a valuable purpose. I know your standards for weed control are irrationally high. And if you want to achieve those irrationally high standards for weed control, we need to keep those pre-emergent residuals in the program. So don't be tempted to weaken that program down to where it's not really serving a weed benefit purpose, just to get your beans off to a quicker, easier start. Soybeans are tougher than you give them credit for, and they will get through that herbicide stress. And the early season stress they go through really does not have much of an impact on their yield potential. And even if you do lose a bushel or two of potential because of that stress, if you gain 10 bushel potential because of the planting date, you're still 8 or 9 ahead. So it's still worth doing. And it's still I think the number one factor in influencing the yield potential of your soybeans is timely planting. So I agree with Adam on that. So I've actually got an RFD interview coming up tomorrow that I need to prepare a little bit for. And they were wanting to talk about strategies for managing fertilizer in these high fertilizer price environments, and what do you do to manage costs, and so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about fertility management. So just the basics. Soil testing is the place I always start. Soil testing can look expensive when you look at the bill that you get for sampling and testing, say 2,000 acres of ground. But when you look at the cost of soil testing per acre relative to what you're going to invest in that acre to produce an acre of corn or soybeans, and especially when you consider the fact that you only need to do those soil tests every 3 or 4 years in most situations, and when you break that cost down over time per acre, it's insignificant. So it's always a little surprising to me and a little concerning to me when I hear the statistics of the percent of acres that are regularly soil tested is, I would say a little bit embarrassing that it's not more than it is. So if you don't typically do a good And I do a grid sample, whether you want a VRT apply or not, we can talk about that. But even if you're not a believer in variable rate applications, I would still pay for grid sampling of my soil tests. If you want to do it by zone, that's fine. If you want to set up management zones, but wherever you pull those samples, they should be GPS, geospatially referenced. So every time you test, you can get back to that same spot as close as possible. Because if you pull the test from, if you've got a field here, and let's say we pull 4 samples out of that field, if you're only pulling 4 samples out of that field, it better be 20 acres or smaller, or you need more samples. But if 3 years later when you test here, 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 and here, these two things don't correlate very well to each other. And you got to get back to the same spot as close as you can, so you can try to see. And there's there's more art than science to soil testing, and that makes soil testing frustrating. And some people, maybe they don't feel it's worth it because the results are not that repeatable and the results are not that accurate, and they're not perfect, but they're well worth having, and they're the best information we have to go on what's in the soil. So if you don't believe in soil testing, I would challenge you to reconsider that point. And I do think that is a very good place to start when you're looking at fertilizer prices as high as they are, is what's in the soil. Number 2 is, how's the crop yielding? And I'm a big removal rate spreader. So I do VRT applications on my own farm, but my VRT applications are based more on my yield map than they are on my soil map, but I consider both. Now, it does get a little complicated to write that script, so I let smart people help me do that because I'm not capable of figuring that out. But what I want to do on my farm is I want to put back what I took off. And if I'm in an area that I want to build, I'm going to put back more than I took off. If I'm in an area where I want to do some mining because I think my soil tests are higher than they need to be, and that's a good position to be in these days. So if you've been over fertilizing a little bit in some cases, these days would be a good time to make a withdrawal from that bank account. And there's nothing wrong with doing a little bit of mining if you've got really high soil test levels. Now, we could get into a discussion about, is it okay to put on 0? Or is it not okay to put on 0? I do 0. I don't mind 0 if you've got really high soil test levels. If you don't believe in 0, that's okay. Maybe you put on 50% removal where you've got really high tests, and you start to slowly ratchet those tests down, but you just don't feel good about 0. And that's okay too. But what I do on mine is I look first at the yield, then I look at the soil test. If the soil tests are higher than I think they should be, I put on less than I removed. If the soil tests are lower than I think they should be, I put on more than I removed. And I should have done the math on this before we started, but if you've got spots in your field making 310 bushel corn, and you've got spots in your field making, 95 bushel soybeans, do the math on what kind of fertilizer you're removing there. That is expensive. But I would remind you of this. What's 310 bushel of corn worth? What's 95 bushel of soybeans worth? That part of your field rewarded you, so you should reward that part of your field by putting back at least what you took off of it, unless your soil tests tell you that your levels are sky high and maybe you don't have to. So, and then that part of the field that made 180 corn and 47 bushel beans. Now, here's where you want to refer back to your soil tests. So do your soil tests indicate that soil fertility could have been a reason the yields were low? And do your soil tests indicate they're the reason that spot was high? Usually they do not. That's something that frustrates people about soil testing, because they think the soil test is going to say you got excellent fertility here and you've got poor fertility here. And that would make you feel good about, well, okay, all I need to do to make this field really good is to build my fertility here to get this yield up to this. What typically you find is you've got poor fertility here and you've got excess fertility here. So what up with that? Why is that? Why is the highest yielding part of my field have lower fertility than the poorest yielding part of my field? It's because this spot's the best part of your field, not because of the fertility. It's the best part of your field because of the soil type, the drainage, the slope, something else about that part of the field is what makes it the best part of your field. And you have never put on enough fertilizer on that part of the field because you've probably never put on what you've removed from that. Versus this spot down here, you've been over fertilizing that spot for as long as you farm that farm. And what's holding the yield of that spot back might be drainage, might be soil type, might be organic matter, might be whatever. But the soil test will probably confirm it's not fertility. So this spot down here, you may not need any fertilizer, maybe for a few years to keep raising the same yield that you've been raising, because fertility is not what's holding your yield back in that spot. This spot up here, maybe if it had good fertility, it would have been 325 and 105 instead of 310 and 95. I would argue that even though that's the best part of your field, if it's under fertilized, you don't know how good that part of your field could have been, if it had better fertility. So that's something that soil testing can do for you. And then we can talk about, what nutrients do we truly need? I'm not going to delve into, all the different micronutrients that you could be applying. There's probably going to be some people that think that, I'm just going to stay meat and potatoes is all I'm going to worry about when fertilizer prices are as high as they are. Other people are going to look at it like, hey, I can sell corn for $6.50 and beans for $14. So I'm going to put some gravy on those meat and potatoes, and I'm going to look at things like zinc. I'm going to look at things like boron. I'm going to look at other micronutrients that we know will sometimes give us a positive yield bump. So that kind of comes down to a philosophical, and it also depends a little bit on, what type of equipment do you have? Do you have starter on your planter? If you do, it really opens up a lot of possibilities to manage some of that stuff a little more precisely. Are you a banded fertility person? If you're putting fertility in a band, that gives you more options to do. Every time I talk about banded fertility, the conversation comes up about, well, how much more efficient is the fertilizer in the band? And can I use less because I'm putting it in a band? And I'm probably a little bit off the reservation on that in some people's minds. And I've had some fairly lively debates with some people that believe in reducing fertilizer applications because of the efficiency of banding. I do not personally. All you're doing if you put on less when you band is you're mining your soil, because it doesn't matter if you raise 285 bushel corn. 285 bushel corn is going to remove the same pounds of nutrients from your field if it's in a band versus if it's in broadcast. It does not matter. Now, can you raise better corn while mining your field if you band? Yes. Can you maybe delay the yield reduction that I think will eventually come by not putting on enough fertilizer if you band? Yes. Can you use less fertilizer and achieve the same yield on rented ground that you maybe don't care about the long-term fertility of? Yes. There's things you can do with, got my phone ringing. Jim Burkle, I'll call you later. So anyway, people sometimes justify the expense of banding. They justify if you're banding with liquid products, which tend to be more expensive. Some people will justify the added expense of that product by saying, well, we can reduce the rate because it's more efficient in a band. It is more efficient in a band. but that doesn't mean that you want to lower the fertility on the acre. And some of the work that Dr. Belo has done at U of I, that Adam was involved with in his former life, has clearly shown that you don't really want to reduce the amount of fertilizer you're using, even if you're putting it in a band. As we push populations higher, and this is, I'll give Dr. Belo's group credit for discovering this and documenting this and actually quantifying the size reduction in the root mass of corn as you plant corn thicker. So the more plants you have and the more competition you have from plants, the smaller that root system gets. And the smaller your root system is, the less soil you're going to explore to feed that plant. So if you've got a smaller root system exploring less soil, you have to have a higher concentration of nutrients in that soil to get the same amount of nutrient in the plant. And we're actually trying to get more nutrient in the plant. If you look at anybody that's doing well in any sort of yield contest, none of them are skimping on fertilizer. Now, can you say, well, yeah, but are they truly being profitable with what they're doing? Well, maybe not. That's you got to find that balancing act. But typically, in a commodity-driven system, bushels is what's going to make you profitable. If you can raise more bushels, especially when corn's 650, you're going to be way more ahead than trying to save a few bucks and costing yourself a few bushels. So I know fertilizer is expensive. Your fertilizer bill is probably going to be the biggest it's ever been this year for corn and soybeans both. But don't forget the value of what you're producing as well. Now, the day's coming, on the backside of this, great period of time we're enjoying in prosperity and profitability of agriculture, when we're going to be selling $3 corn, possibly with today's input prices, before things kind of reach a new equilibrium. That'll be different. But right now, we are blessed with commodity prices that are doing a pretty good job offsetting high input prices. So keep that in mind as you're making your fertility decisions. I talk a lot about sulfur. So sulfur is, relative to other things, a relatively inexpensive nutrient. Now, does it cost way more than it used to? Yes. Does it cost way more than you wish it did? Yes. Name me anything that you wouldn't say yes to those two questions on. Doesn't mean that we don't want to use it. Doesn't mean that we don't want to use more. Producer Adam's making notes here. That's making me nervous. He usually doesn't make notes. So he's either going to give me some feedback after the episode's over, or he's got a really good question and he doesn't want to forget it, one of the two. Or maybe he's making his grocery list for later because he's bored to death. I couldn't tell you. So anyway, so sulfur is not a micronutrient. It's always the first thing I say. It gets lumped in with micros because we don't use as much of it, but it is a macronutrient. So after nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium comes sulfur. So it is the fourth most important nutrient. and I would say it might be the second most important nutrient after nitrogen for corn, simply because the soil holds a certain amount of P and K. And whether you're applying P or K or not, your soil is releasing P and K to your crop. You might need more there. It might not release enough. You might benefit from having more P and K available to your crop. But sulfur is much like nitrogen. It is, in its natural state, is a negatively charged ion in the soil. Soil cannot hold negatively charged particles. So sulfur is more mobile in the soil than nitrogen is. So the soil organic matter releases sulfur. Just like mineralization, there's a nitrogen mineralization cycle. There's a sulfur mineralization cycle, same way. So if you've got a high organic matter soil, it is mineralizing and is releasing sulfur to your crop throughout the season. That doesn't mean it's giving the crop all at once. It just means it's giving you some free sulfur out of that organic matter. But that released sulfur, it isn't going to wait around forever for your crop to use it. It can be leached to a tile line. It can be lost. It's not going to denitrify like nitrogen does. So we're not going to lose it up into the atmosphere, but it can move down to it, leach down to a tile line. And so we can't really hold sulfur. We can't really build sulfur. If you dump on a lot of elemental sulfur every year, you can make it look like you're building sulfur because of that slow release elemental sulfur that you're putting down. But I would argue that, most people that are using sulfur should be using more, and everybody who's not using sulfur needs to use some. It is the most common nutrient deficiency that I see year in and year out in corn. It's affecting soybeans as well. It's not quite as visible in soybeans as it is in corn, but I would say 9 times out of 10, somebody is worried about their corn not having a good color, and they think it's because of nitrogen. It's actually because of sulfur. Especially cool springs, especially no-till, especially challenging environments, and especially low organic matter soils are where we most often, almost every year, see sulfur deficiency. To not see sulfur deficiency in your crop will take a minimum of 20 units of sulfur. So if you throw on, say, 3 gallon of thiazole, if that's your sulfur program, 3 gallon of thiazole is giving you about 9 units of readily available sulfur. It's a great source of sulfur at about 8 gallons. It's not an adequate source of sulfur at 3 gallons. Now, you can use elemental. Elemental is the cheapest form of sulfur you're going to get. So usually a 90% concentration product. You can put it in with your dry blend. It's easy to do. Be aware it will not throw as far in a spread pattern as P and K. So sometimes when I see guys are using all dry sulfur, we get a lot of streaking because it's not flying as far in the spread pattern as your P and K is. So keep that in mind and maybe talk to your applicator about that. But keep in mind, if you're using elemental, it is at most about 50% efficient, meaning that about half of the units that you apply, in theory, will be available to the following year's crop, and you cannot control when it becomes available for the following year's crop. Now, if you put it on every year, it's a little bit like using manure that also breaks down slowly over time in your soil. So let's say in 2022, you put on 20 pounds of elemental sulfur. And I'm talking 20 pounds of product, which would be 18 units of sulfur. Roughly 9 units of that would have been available this year. A quarter of that, so about 2.4 units roughly, will be available the following year. An eighth, 16th, you keep ratcheting it on down. So you'll still be getting some of the sulfur that you applied in 2020, in 21 and 22 and 23. And then if you put on another 20 pounds in 21 and another 20 pounds in 22, over time, it kind of compounds a little bit. It's not like the magic of interest, but it's somewhat like that. So over time, if you put on enough elemental sulfur, you can probably meet the needs of your crop, but it's going to take quite a bit, especially in those early years when you're getting started. If you're going to make fall applications, usually we recommend an elemental form rather than a sulfate form, because the sulfate form, using sulfate sulfur in the fall would be kind of like using UAN for your nitrogen source for your corn in the fall. There's a risk of losing that, especially if we have a wet spring. So I would prefer sulfate forms like a thiazole or an ammonium sulfate in the spring. Use elemental in the fall. I like some of both in my systems. I've been using 20 units of sulfur every year on both crops, and I've decided that's not enough. So there's, I don't know where the upper end of sulfur is, but like I say, if you've been putting on a little bit, do more. If you've done none, start doing some. I think I could make an argument that you would be better off to skimp on P&K and shift some of those dollars into sulfur, honestly, in a lot of situations. The other part of fertility that gets overlooked every time because it's not as sexy as any of this other stuff is pH. So I should have mentioned that right off the bat. If you're farming ground that's got a pH of 5.8, before you waste any money on fertilizer, I'd invest heavily in getting your pH corrected and get that pH up to at least something in the low sixes. On my farm at home, where I've got either owned land or long-term leases with landlords I've got good relationships with, and I'm fairly comfortable I'll be farming the ground in 10 years, I'm liming to a 6.4 pH. So something in the mid sixes is a nice place to be if the landowner is paying for the lime or you've got a long-term lease on the ground. And that's really another thing that your soil test can help you with. So the most accurate soil test measurement is organic matter, CEC, and pH, followed by P and K, and then you get into things like nitrogen and sulfur, and the micros are the least reliable numbers that you're going to get off of your soil test. But that pH data is pretty good. pH does not vary as drastically across the landscape as P and K do. So variable rate applications work very well with lime. And if you've got places in a field, and this is not uncommon, that you might have a 6.8 pH over here and a 5.8 pH over there, that 6.8, you don't want to put any lime on. You get much higher than that, it starts to become a problem. So if you've got soils that are in the high sixes, I don't put any lime on that. But if you've got a spot in that field that's in the low fives or the mid fives, it might need 3 ton a couple different times to get the pH of that up to a 6.4. So VRT lime is something that I'm a big believer in. So I'll pause there. Adam was diligently scribbling down notes there. So comments, questions, Adam?
No. I was just had some different things I was going to ask you about, but you covered the pH,
Okay.
sulfur. I was just making some notes on soil testing. It's more of a art than a science sort of thing.
Yep.
I think it's more of a, it's very important.
Yep.
I don't disagree.
Yep.
And I think it's about telling you where things are way out of whack.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's not a rifle approach. It's more of a shotgun approach
Right.
to make sure you're in the right area. And definitely with the banding, I think the mindset to have with banding fertility is that I'm wanting to try and grow more with the same amount of fertilizer that I am currently utilizing.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yep.
So,
no, that's good.
Did have a conversation / question. Looks like you're moving on to tillage, which is perfect, right?
No,
you're talking about fertilizer.
I was thinking about soil testing.
So I did have a tillage question.
Okay.
If you want to jump to, we got
Yep.
808. So
Yep.
we can interrupt real quick. So it's kind of about vertical tillage.
Yeah.
So been running vertical tillage tools for a few years. Feel like I'm getting more of a jackhammer effect out of it than or like a road vibrator effect.
Surely not.
Yeah, right. And he's just thinking about how he should be or not should be utilizing his vertical tillage tools.
Oh man, you're can we talk about politics or something less, maybe religion, something less controversial than vertical tillage? So,
well, I'll just break the ice. I do not like vertical.
I know you and I can have that conversation very easily. I'm not sure I want to have it on live TV, but so anyway, I like to tease some of my friends that are pulling a vertical tillage tool that costs them a lot of money, that maybe they should consider selling that while the resale value is still high before people find out that they're not really worth all that much. But the biggest trend in agriculture right now, outside of cover crops, maybe would be vertical tillage. And I challenge some manufacturers. It's a little bit disingenuous to have that word vertical in there. Some of these tools have gotten so aggressive. It's just plain tillage now. It seems like with every new generation of tool, vertical till tool, we get closer to full width tillage. And we, if you're a no-tiller at heart, like I am, residue does not scare you. Residue does not bother you. Residue does not frustrate you. Residue is something you're kind of proud of. But if you're a tillage person at heart, the more aggressive your vertical till tool is, the better you feel. And if you hit it once and hitting a second time makes it look better and makes more residue disappear, you'll probably like that even better. So there are some acres out there that are getting vertical tilled twice with tools that are so aggressive that I really don't think they should even be called vertical till tools. And that, if that's what you like, that's okay. It's a free country. You can do what you, used to be. You can do what you can do what you want to a certain extent. But I just don't necessarily think that every acre has to be vertical tilled. The challenge that vertical till creates is this: it gives you a mixture of sized residue and soil, which is great for residue decomposition. Getting that residue chopped into pieces and mixing it with soil is absolutely the best way to stimulate microbial degradation of that residue. So if that is your purpose, it is helping you do that. And you will decompose that residue faster if you get it chopped up and you get it in contact with the soil. The challenge I have with it, especially in a corn on corn situation, is what that does is you end up with a soil horizon in the top 2 inches, let's say, that is about a 50-50 mix of soil and I'm gonna call it trash in this case because it's kind of causing me a problem. And in that seed trench where we're dropping that seed, and you got your seed firmer coming along here and pressing it down in the bottom of that seed trench, if there's all these pieces of residue here, you're not getting as good a seed to soil contact in that. So that affects corn more than beans, but it's not helping beans either. So to me, residue is best managed either on top or buried deeply. And anywhere in between, I see challenges related to residue. So be a little bit cautious with that. The question that Adam was asked, it sounds like somebody thinks that they might be getting a little bit of a compaction layer from their vertical till usage. I'm not as big a fan of vertical till, period, but I'm kind of a hater of it in the spring. So if you're going to do it, please do it in the fall. Please do it when it's fit. I see vertical till tools parked in barn lots all the time, packed full of mud. You're not helping yourself there. So if your vertical till tool is plugging with mud, you probably need to park it at that point. Residue that's left on top can be managed with some row cleaners. Residue that's on top can easily be moved out of the way of your planter row unit, and you can manage that residue. Now, from a disease standpoint, burying residue, decomposing residue can help. So I've seen some guys have great success with strip till corn on corn. Where you don't touch a thing, you just go in and you strip in between the old corn stalk rows. That can work fabulously until something called diplodia makes your life very, very challenging. If you vertical till, you're not burying enough of that residue to make the disease go away. So again, it's not going to eliminate the disease. It does give you a warmer, drier seed bed. Which can be beneficial. There are advantages to that. A lot of guys are seeding their cover crop with, they go out and broadcast some fertilizer and some cover crop seed and then hit it with a vertical till. Great incorporation tool for fertilizer and cover crop seed. And there actually has been people talk about, someday we might either have to incorporate fertilizer or or subsurface banded. We talked about banding earlier. If you're broadcasting, there are places that, they don't want that fertilizer left on the surface, because we've realized that even in a no-till situation with a lot of residue, we're not getting as much runoff off of that soil, but the runoff that does come off of that soil is pretty heavily loaded with soluble nutrients. So leaving all that fertilizer just laying on top is probably not ideal either. And a vertical tillage tool can help incorporate that fertilizer. So they have a purpose. I think they're getting overused. I think they're getting used at the wrong time. I think some of them are kind of ridiculously aggressive, but people love them. And the best way for me to discredit myself as an agronomist with some people is to say anything negative about vertical tillage. So I've stumbled all over that line here, and some of you probably never coming back again, because dumbass Lance is hating on my vertical till tool. I own one. I use it sometimes. I don't particularly like the one that I've got. Here's my other pet peeve I just can't help myself, Adam. The ones that leave it looking so nice, then it all blows in the ditch. And I don't want any of my residue blowing off the field. Mine doesn't let anything blow to the ditch. But when I drive across the field in the spring, it feels like I'm driving on speed bumps. It's just not very uniform. And if your field feels like speed bumps, I don't think your seed depth is going to be quite as consistent as if it was a uniform field. So if you can find a tool that leaves most of the residue on the surface, that doesn't compact your soil, that doesn't cost $100 and some odd $1,000, that doesn't let all your residue blow away, and leaves your field uniform and smooth on top, let me know what that is, and I might like to have one of those. I don't know that I've found that one yet, and I do think that there's certainly a place for it. I know some guys that like to do corn on corn strip till. They will run a vertical till tool across, a fairly aggressive one, just to manage the residue, so they can get that corn residue through that strip till bar. And if you didn't do that, you probably couldn't get through the field with a strip till bar. Just be aware that if the only tillage you're doing on your corn on corn is vertical till, you're not really eliminating any risk for diplodia, because you've still got so much inoculum close enough to the surface. I don't think I've seen any indication that vertical tilled residue corn on corn has any less diplodia pressure in it than straight no-till corn on corn. So your vertical till tool, you might like what it's doing for your residue. You might like what it's doing for your seed bed. Don't delude yourself into thinking that you're reducing your risk for diplodia. And diplodia is really what keeps me awake at night for my corn on corn no-till strip till guys, because I've seen some amazing strip till corn on corn. You basically can make that crop feel like it's growing in soybean stubble if you make a nice strip between the corn rows, corn on corn. And if you get the wrong year and the wrong weather pattern, and you get bad diplodia, you can raise some almost unsellable grain in that system. So just be aware of that. If you've done it for years, you've never had a problem, I'm going to add one word to that sentence, and that word would be yet. I do not think, you can be comfortable, at least I can't, without thinking about, well, what happens if I get a bad diplodia year in that, because you can't plant a hybrid that won't get it. You can't spray a fungicide that will prevent it. The best way to prevent diplodia is to either remove or bury the residue, and it needs to be buried more than a vertical till tool is going to do it. I've seen situations where guys bale corn stalks on this field, has no diplodia. I've seen situations where guys run cattle on stalks, no diplodia. I've seen places where there's been field fires, no diplodia. So we are not going to recommend burning of corn stalks. There's only so much of a market for baled corn stalks, and not many of us have cattle anymore. So we're down to tillage as the most practical way to manage diplodia, and vertical tillage is not tillage when it comes to disease management. Vertical tillage is more of a residue decomposition, but you're not going to decompose the pathogen away. There's going to be plenty of residue there for the pathogen to survive on. And if, in the case of diplodia, if you had any, and if it was noticeable, do not go back to corn in that field would be my recommendation. Because sometimes even if you didn't notice it, even if you weren't getting a dock at the elevator, even if you didn't see those mummified ears, there's probably a little bit there. And every year you go back to corn on that field, it's going to get worse potentially. You got to have the right weather. So it's like any other disease. If you don't have the right environment, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have a problem. If you've got the perfect environment, you might have a problem no matter what you do. Generally speaking, we're somewhere in the middle where the environment is good enough that the disease can survive. And what we do from a management standpoint is going to influence how well it survives. So,
yep, don't underestimate rotation.
Yep, it does makes everything easier. The ironic thing about rotation is if you're trying to raise 85 plus bushel beans consistently, 50-50 rotation is going to make that harder to do. So if you can master corn on corn, like a 2-to-1 rotation, if you can maintain yield in that corn on corn year and a 2-to-1 rotation, you're going to add bushels to your bean yield. So the ironic thing about soybeans is the less often you raise them, the better they're going to be. So this quick list I made, this is relative to soil testing. Adam made a comment that soil testing is more of an art than a science. It's both. And if you want to make your art more scientific, here are the things that
need to be consistent.
That you need to be consistent about. Yeah. So do not be haphazard about your soil sampling depth. So if you do it yourself, 6 2/3 inches is actually what it's calibrated to. Some people do 6, some people do 7. That's fine. But if you pull a 5 versus an 8, there's going to be a big difference in those test results because we put our applications where? On the surface typically. So your fertility level is the highest at the surface and it goes down with depth. And so if you're averaging 8 inches of soil, it will be lower than if you're averaging 5 inches of soil, 9 times out of 10, guarantee it. So you need to be a consistent depth. If you're hiring it done, hopefully their technicians are well trained. Hopefully know that's important. Hopefully they're conscientious. Hopefully they're not having a bad day. Hopefully they care about their job. We won't go there. So that reminds me, we will go there for a minute. So had breakfast the other day at a popular breakfast spot. I will not name it, but this is just off the interstate. Popular breakfast spot, does big business for breakfast. They don't even open till 7 anymore, which blows my mind that a place known for breakfast wouldn't be open until 7. So at 7:02, they unlock the door and let me and our group in. And the young woman that was waiting on us is taking our order, and the phone starts to ring. She says, "I'm sorry, guys. I'm the only one here. I got to go answer that phone." So this poor girl, bless her heart, I hope she doesn't quit because she's so miserable because none of her coworkers showed up for work, is waiting tables, answering the phone. I think she had to wash some dishes to bring us some silverware. She's bussing tables. She's like the only one there. It's just sad. It just frustrates me. Anyway, so, but I digress. We'll go back to soil testing. So depth, placement, that's the GPS point I'm talking about. If X marks the spot, don't take the test from Y this time and T next time. Stay on X. So you need your GPS. So crop makes a difference. So you should always try to make a note of this. If you've sampled this field following corn, every time you sample it, you should be following the same crop, because if you're not, that's going to skew your test results. Time of year can be important due to primarily this, but you should, within reason, not soil test dry powder or mud. We'd like to have moist soil to test. And here's the tricky part. You'd like to have the same level of moisture in that soil test. Now, I get it. That you can't manage that perfectly. The way I try to manage this is by soil testing in June. So that probably sounds a little weird because soil testing is, forever been a fall thing, sometimes a spring thing. It's never been a June thing. So my program is the way I do this, and I hire it done. I don't do it myself. I try to soil test around June 1st in soybeans every time. And you can run your 4-wheeler, your Gator, or whatever your soil testing, group is using through my little soybeans around June 1st, not hurting anything. So that's my program. The nice thing about June 1st is the lab's not very busy June 1st. They're looking for soil tests to run June 1st. So that's good from a workload perspective. And I would argue that usually June 1st, unless it's a weird year, we've got decent soil moisture. The fall, sometimes it's muddier than hell. Sometimes it's bone dry. Our fall moisture levels can vary, I think, more than our June 1st moisture levels can. And if it's dry, if it's dry enough to be driving through my bean fields, it's not going to be mud. That's just my program. And then go to the same lab every time. Unless your lab goes out of business or something, you're going to have to make a change. But be consistent, and that consistency will help. Instead of a 50-50 art and science mix, I'm trying to move it to like a 70-30. Where the 70 is the science part. Always going to be some art there in that. Okay. Anything on the chat, Adam?
Nope, we're quiet.
Okay. All right. So I'll talk about anhydrous real quick. So talked to a friend of mine that manages 2 retail locations. They're in a heavy fall ammonia market. He's estimating he's about 50% applied with his anhydrous. They've been hitting it really hard the last 2 to 3 weeks. A lot of people, when people start every year, think, boy, it's a little early. I don't think I want to be first. I'm kind of on that list myself. I don't necessarily want to be first. If you're going to apply nitrogen early in the fall, absolutely need an inhibitor with it. Don't be fiddling around with cutting the rate. Don't be fiddling around with taking the product out. I've known guys before that when nitrogen gets expensive, they're looking to save some money, and so they pull the inhibitor out. I've never understood. If you want to not use an inhibitor, you should do it when nitrogen's cheap, not when it's expensive. So the more expensive the nitrogen gets, the more valuable the inhibitor is. The earlier you apply, the more valuable the inhibitor is. If you're willing to take a chance on not putting an inhibitor on and you want to wait till December to apply your nitrogen, that's probably okay. The challenge with waiting to December is, will you get a weather window that works? Will there still be product to apply? Can you get it done? So the trade-off that we make between timing and getting the work done is, the earlier we go, the better your chances are that you're going to get it done and you're going to have good field conditions for doing it. Field conditions have been awesome this year so far for fall anhydrous. It's been going on beautiful. I don't think there's a darn thing wrong with mid and late October anhydrous, as long as you're using an inhibitor with it. Our soil temperatures are not that warm. Yes, we're having some 70-degree days here and there, but then we're back in the 50s and 60s and in the 30s at night. So I'm not worried about this nitrogen that's going on. I was pleasantly surprised talking to my buddy that logistically, I thought we'd have lots of challenges just with situations on the river and situations with trucking. Anhydrous can't move by rail anymore, so virtually all anhydrous comes either on a pipeline, on a barge, or in a truck. There's issues with barges because of labor shortages and low water levels and demand for other things. And he did tell me that anhydrous kind of gets priority moving on a barge, because it's a pretty big liability for anybody to have a barge full of anhydrous ammonia just sitting somewhere. So once that barge gets loaded, they kind of want to get it to where it's going. So that helps. Obviously, trucks are at a premium, and there's just never enough trucks. It seems like, diesel fuel is expensive. There's, all of these challenges logistically with getting that product moved. Can do two things. It can make it cost more, and it can make it be not available. And it's kind of crazy, the world we're living in these days. Things that used to be normal, used to be assumed, we used to be able to count on stuff. You just can't take anything for granted anymore, it seems like. And I know this fall at harvest, I got to the point where the fact that a particular part for my junky old equipment cost me twice as much as it did last year, I got to the point where I was just happy they had one. So I didn't really care about the price. I needed the product. And so fertilizer is kind of that way too. It gets to a point where, yeah, the price is a challenge, but there's things that could happen beyond our control that might make the product not even available. And we just don't really think about the possibility of things like that happening. But there's just so much stuff in the world and so much things domestically that make it difficult to get product from A to B and make sure you've got enough product at point A to get it to point B. And can you get it to point B as fast as the people at point C, D, and E are using the product? Just a lot of challenges with that. So if you get a window to get something done on dry fertilizer or fall ammonia, if you're a believer in fall ammonia, I wouldn't be waiting around. I would get it done. There haven't really been a lot of challenges to this point, and we've got a lot of product applied. Doesn't mean that there won't still be challenges. There are challenges about every year, with supply somewhere, and it's usually not a supply problem. It's usually more of a logistical problem of getting it from the terminal to where it's being used fast enough. Because we can, farmers can plant corn faster than we can get it sprayed, and we can put on anhydrous faster than people can get it trucked to your local facility at times as well. So things have been going pretty well. We've had some good weather. One point he made to me was that harvest has gotten a little more extended this year. Not everybody's done harvesting, and so things have been a little more spread out, which has made it a little easier for them to keep up. But always a challenge getting all the fall work done that we would like to do in the fall, and anything that we can't get done in the fall. If you're typically a fall person, if that gets moved into spring, things get really challenging, because in the spring we're focused on planting, herbicide applications, the little bit of spring fertilizer work that we do. If we don't get all of our fall fertility work done the way we normally like to, the more of that gets pushed into the spring, that just really gums up the works. And we're not set up to do fall in spring. We need to do fall in fall, and then we can focus on spring in spring rather than trying to finish up what we should have got done in the fall. So that's just my quick synopsis on the fertilizer markets and what's going on there. Appreciate your attention here this morning. We'll go ahead and wrap things up. We'll be back in 2 weeks, Adam. What is that date? 17th of November. We'll be back for our next episode. The
only thing I got left to say is make sure you're talking to your dealer or your rep, whoever, your technical agronomist, about the Yield Chasers event. Mm-hmm. We're coming up on that quicker than you think. So about 4 months, and we'll be having that big event in February, I believe. So
I had a good friend of mine sent me a text a couple of days ago. He was still working on some corn. He wanted to know if 324 was good enough to win the contest. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think I'd probably enter that. My last two fields haven't made 200, so I'm no threat to you. So I think I made him feel a little bit bad, but I was a little pissy at the moment, so I was kind of trying to do that. So don't be throwing your big yields in your agronomist's face when he's not getting those yields, because he doesn't like that. So anyway, thanks everybody for being with us here today. It's always fun to hang out with you, and appreciate your questions. Appreciate those of you that like to watch it after the fact. Always love interacting with the live audience. We started doing this Ask the Agronomist format when we couldn't do real meetings. We can do real meetings again, and I prefer real meetings. Those of you that know me know I'm not a big social media guy. which people find ironic that I'm on social media. But but anyway, if we get a good participation from our live audience, then I can it kind of has that live meeting feel. So that's why we appreciate our live audience so much, and why we try to get more people to tune in live. So if you've always been a after the fact recorded viewer watcher, we appreciate you. Consider joining us live, and that way you can have fun with us. So anyway, appreciate your time. Everybody stay safe. Hopefully get your harvest wrapped up soon. I wish I'm to that point where I want to be done. And so hopefully you're getting close as well. So everybody take care. Thank you.